Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Present Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Jason Charbonneau. Did I say that right?
Charbonneau, yeah.
Charbonneau, host and director of the YouTube channel Think Anomalous. Now, I've had you on before, Jason, a couple times. We both seem to have an interest. We both seem to have an interest in paranormal, or more broadly speaking, theories or observations that don't fit within the strict materialist reductionist paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And while there might be a debate on how you can account for these different anomalous things, they start to add up. And then, then it leads us to question the paradigm itself and, well, what other explanations might there be for it? And of course, one of the most famous and popular of those exceptions is the UFO phenomena. And you've done a lot of videos on the UFO phenomena. So could you briefly describe sort of in the modern context how the UFO phenomena began and how it's sort of evolved over the century?
Sure, yeah. So the kind of classic story for UFO history claims that it starts in 1947 with a sighting by a guy named Kenneth Arnold, who was flying a private plane by Mount Rainier in Washington State, and sees nine what he described as delta-shaped objects, kind of appearing to kind of bounce through the air. The media kind of spun that. He described them as bouncing like saucers skipping over water, and the media kind of spun that into flying saucer, which is how we got that term. And then after that sighting was widely reported, the media took it quite seriously because Kenneth Arnold was a pilot, and he was trained in identifying certain objects and calculating their speed, and he gave some pretty detailed information in the report. So the military took it quite seriously. The media kind of ran away with it. Within a couple of weeks of that, you get the Roswell incident being reported in the newspapers. And there's just sort of this explosion of sightings across the United States and across the world. So that's kind of, that marks the beginning of the modern phase of UFO history. But really, we know for sure that it goes back at least a few years before that. I just recently did a video on the Foo Fighter sightings, so-called Foo Fighter sightings of World War II. And these were basically just sort of anomalous lights, mostly, balls of light, some kind of strange craft seen by pilots during World War II. These things were seen by Allied pilots and Axis pilots, German pilots, as well as some Japanese pilots, although the records there aren't as great. And of course, throughout the war, pilots are reporting their sightings to superiors. Intelligence people are looking these over, trying to find out what they are. Everybody kind of assumes that they're secret weapons for the other side. So the Allies believe that it was a German secret weapon being tested. And the Germans, as we come to find out at the end of the war, believe that they were Allied secret weapons. Of course, you get to the end of the war and everyone realizes, well, it wasn't you guys. So what was it? Now that nobody was calling these things UFOs at that time. But those sightings were kind of logged, and we have the documentation. And of course, those sightings reemerge in 1947 after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, and once UFOs kind of become a popular topic. But the actual term UFO doesn't actually come into use until about 1952. So yeah, those are kind of all your important starting dates. But of course, we know, and anyone who watches my channel will know, that the UFO phenomenon is actually hundreds, if not thousands of years older than that. It's just that, for a lot of historical sightings, you don't have the kind of sleek metallic discs that, tend to be seen today or tend to have been seen in the 40s and 50s. But in some form, the UFO phenomenon goes back thousands of years.
Now, within the UFO community, which is already itself kind of a fringe community, the dominant position is that these are extraterrestrials. But then as a sort of fringe movement within a fringe movement, there is the extra-dimensional camp. And the extra-dimensional camp would be someone like Jean Hynek and Jacques Vallée. So maybe you could explain what the two camps are, who are sort of leading thinkers, and what are their explanations and arguments for this phenomena?
Sure, yeah. So it just seemed like kind of a natural assumption beginning in at least as early as 1947 that these things were most likely extraterrestrials. At the very beginning, I would say 1947, 1948, a lot of people assumed that they might have been Soviet craft as well, some sort of Soviet spy craft. And that theory was taken pretty seriously by the U.S. government, U.S. intelligence. But we know kind of right from the start, right from 1947, that there was kind of a split within U.S. intelligence where, maybe about half of officials believed that these things were Soviet craft, and about half people thought that they were extraterrestrial. And they actually formed a few investigation groups. There was Project Sign, which ran from 1947 to 48, which actually concluded that these things were probably extraterrestrials. Word is that the U.S. intelligence did not like that conclusion, kind of disbanded the group and asked them to come up with another explanation, basically. There was another group called Project Grudge after that, which was then kind of scrapped again and renamed Project Blue Book. And this was sort of the U.S. government's main UFO investigation group for a good 22 years. It was closed in 1970. And Project Blue Book hired a guy named J. Allen Hynek, was a very well-respected astronomer and scientist at Northwestern University at the time, I believe is when he was hired. And he was kind of the scientific consultant for the investigations. Now people came to figure out that Project Blue Book was really just kind of trying to debunk UFO sightings. They didn't really seem to take them too seriously. J. Allen Hynek, got more and more frustrated with this group. And by the time the group is closed in 1970, J. Allen Hynek kind of strikes out on his own and finally starts admitting that, hey, these things might really be extraterrestrials. But around the same time, in fact, the year that Project Blue Book closed, an associate of Hynek's named Jacques Vallée, who is a French astronomer and computer scientist, fiction author, ufologist. He's one of these guys with just his resume will make your head spin. He kind of does everything. But he wrote a book called Passport to Magonia. I have my copy here. I highly recommend this to any of your watchers. This is a fantastic book. I recommend it often on my channel. But basically, Jacques Vallée, who before this had actually advocated the extraterrestrial hypothesis, kind of started to have some doubts about that. And he wrote this book really to kind of go over the entire history of the UFO phenomenon. He was really one of the first guys to go back and look at historical sightings, before Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sightings. And even to look at things like fairy encounters from the Middle Ages and, Marian apparitions, within the Christian tradition. Basically any kind of anomalous sighting or entity sighting throughout history, and kind of came up with this hypothesis that, maybe the phenomenon is sort of disguising itself as alien technology. The entities are disguising themselves as aliens, but really they have the ability to appear any way that they want, or they have some ability to manipulate our minds to make themselves appear however they want. And so his argument is essentially that it is kind of one constant phenomenon that's constantly changing its appearance and constantly kind of disguising itself within our culture by kind of cloaking itself in the kind of mythology of the time. So Jacques Vallée was really kind of the first guy to champion. It gets called the interdimensional hypothesis or the extra-dimensional hypothesis. I don't even think that Jacques Vallée used that term himself very much. And he wasn't necessarily trying to posit that these things came from some dimension in particular. He just really wanted people to move beyond the extraterrestrial hypothesis. He felt it was limiting. He felt it didn't, it ignored a lot of data. And I should also give credit to a guy named John Keel, who was just kind of a general journalist, but interested in anomalistics, who also wrote a book in 1970 called Operation Trojan Horse, where he pioneered a theory very similar to Jacques Vallée's, which is essentially that this phenomenon, can interact with consciousness, maybe manipulate our minds, and kind of appear to us in different ways in different times and places. So yeah, so anybody who is kind of a skeptic of the extraterrestrial hypothesis or the ETH today probably owes their thinking to Jacques Vallée. There's a few other people today that would back that hypothesis, but really everyone kind of refers back to Jacques Vallée. And of course, he's still alive and still writing and still very much relevant today.
Now, when these phenomena in the modern context were first seen in World War II and then in 1947, what led the scientists at the time to first jump to an extraterrestrial explanation? If it's non-human, I'm saying, because, for example, if you saw something you didn't recognize in antiquity, they'd call it maybe one of the gods, maybe a creature of a spirit of the forest, or maybe like in the medieval era, a saint. What had shifted in thinking that, well, if it's not human, it must be a UFO, it must be alien?
Well,
rather
yeah,
than older examples.
yeah. I mean, I think it has everything to do with kind of where humanity was at the time. You know, of course, you got to remember in 1947, jet technology is just being developed. It was really just introduced by the Nazis in the war, and humanity is kind of preparing to enter space. Like the space race is sort of just beginning. So everyone's kind of thinking about space. Everyone's kind of thinking about moving beyond the planet. And of course, there's been a ton of advances in astronomy. In the previous 20 years before that, discovering Pluto in I think the 30s or something. So humanity is just really starting to kind of learn about the solar system and the galaxy beyond that. And so I think it's just kind of where humanity was at, where science was at. This was something. I mean, there's just not a lot of other explanations that really made sense to kind of scientifically minded people. This was something that everyone believed existed. The greatest minds of the time believed that there are almost certainly extraterrestrials out there somewhere. So I guess it just seemed like kind of a natural connection. If they're not humans, um, what else could they really be? And of course, most people at that time at least wouldn't admit to believing in things like demons or angels or sylphs or fairies or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the last prominent advocates for fairies.
Hmm.
Now you had mentioned that in conjunction with sort of the Lay's alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that there were many sightings of what we would today call UFOs going back many thousands of years. One of your more recent videos deals with ships that were supposed to be flying in the Imperium of the upper atmosphere during the Middle Ages. So maybe you could sort of sketch out some of these historic examples.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sightings go right back to the Bible. Lots of people in the UFO community would know Ezekiel's wheel. Just this really kind of bizarre description of some sort of flying craft that kind of lands before him. And people have tried to, kind of decode what that one means. There's lots of different interpretations of that. But you have sightings. I don't know a lot of them specifically off the top of my head, but I know that you have sightings from ancient China. You have sightings from the Roman Empire. I think Alexander the Great had a few, at least one UFO sighting. And sightings throughout the Middle Ages. You've got monks recording sightings. The sightings that you were talking about in my last video on the flying ships were recorded as early as the 700s in Ireland. And beyond just simply, there's also the sighting over Nuremberg in 1561. I did a whole video on that, where basically people saw this kind of red sun rise in the sky with these two strange kind of red half moons kind of in it. And then all these other objects appear in the sky, balls and tubes that appear to be firing at each other, engaged in some war in the sky. It's a very similar sighting in Basel, Switzerland in 1566, where a bunch of spheres in the sky appeared to do battle with each other. I think one or two of them kind of burst into flames, and then the phenomenon kind of receded. There's other sightings of ships in the sky, armies in the sky marching against each other. I mean, people were always seeing things in the sky. They just didn't always resemble little round saucers, like they became more popular in the 40s and 50s. But beyond that, and one thing that Jacques Vallée tries to really stress is that there are also lots of entity encounters throughout history that may or may not have been associated with UFOs. So, for example, Jacques Vallée talked a lot about the miracle at Fatima, the series of Marian apparitions, some of which the woman appeared in a kind of ball of light that floated down to the ground, and then she emerged from that. So really, if you kind of strip away the aesthetic details of a lot of sightings and just sort of look at entity encounters and things seen in the sky in general, you really realize that there's a huge variety of things seen and entities encountered throughout history. And every culture and every time and place seems to see something that corresponds with their own mythology, something that they believe. So Christians will see, a woman often assumed to be the Mother Mary, or they might see Jesus. Whereas indigenous people, might see their own things, or encounter spirits or ancestors or things like that.
Now, one question. Now, I don't know if the sources are specific enough to answer this, but when I watched your video on the ships in the sky and the men that would swim down to pick up things that were lost. Within a broader Christian Catholic cosmology, what would those beings have been? I mean, they were men and there were angels and there were demons. These people seem to be like men.
Right.
But how could that be? Like, how did the Catholics process that? Or did the sources get that specific?
No, the sources unfortunately don't get that specific. I would say more broadly speaking, I know that there was the idea of the great chain of being, but I don't know that that was really articulated that early in history, like in the 8th century. I know later there was a guy named Paracelsus, a Swiss theologian, who came up with the idea of sylphs, but that was in the 17th century, I believe, mid 17th century. So I don't know that there really was a kind of a go-to explanation for what these human beings, kind of human-looking beings, might have been. But I do know that people had long assumed that they were probably people up in the sky, or other creatures, sharing the earth with humans. That God's creation, was vast and varied, and that humans didn't necessarily know all the different creatures. There is a text from early 9th century France. A Catholic bishop named Agobard talked about people in his region who believed in what were called Magonians. And this is where, of course, Jacques Vallée gets the title Passport to Magonia. But the Magonians were just thought to be people much like us that sailed around in ships in the sky and actually made deals with wizards on Earth, where the wizards would raise storms and blow over people's crops, and then these Magonians would come down in their flying ships and pick up the crops from the kind of hail battered plants. And so every people in every kind of region has their own kind of myths and their own assumptions. But yeah, it was very common to believe that there were other beings out there. I don't know that there was really a specific and rigid kind of theology around exactly who those beings were.
Yeah, one interesting thing is one of the things that Jacques Vallée points out, and that you've pointed out in the video you did on Jacques Vallée's theory, is that each of these aerial sightings has a technology that is either familiar to the people, like, say, a sailing ship would be familiar to the medievals, or technology that was just outside of the reach of people. So these large self-propelled airships in the 1890s, or these sort of jet fighters in the 1940s and 50s. Now, there does seem to be that kind of a trend. But if and I am aware of a certain ufologists who would include Ezekiel's wheel in that category, but that seems to be of a very different nature. That seems to be a thing that's just so far ahead of what anybody's even thinking about, that it's like, it almost sort of like breaks the curve, almost, in the sense that it's not even near future. It's not even remotely familiar to anybody at the time. Right. Is there anything you would want to say about that?
Specifically about Ezekiel's wheel, or
just how it seems to divert from that overall pattern?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, I've tried reading, obviously English translations of that, and it's just very difficult to kind of reconstruct exactly what he's describing. And again, I've seen so many different interpretations of it. Some people claim it, it's describing a helicopter, that there's like rotating blades and things, but I don't know. It's very esoteric. It doesn't really seem like he's describing a technology per se to me. And I think that's one thing that's more common with a lot of ancient sightings, is they didn't necessarily assume, or they most of the time did not assume, that these UFOs seen were technological devices. I think the kind of whole technological angle really begins more in the 20th century, really with the Foo Fighter sightings, I would say, and then the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And that's kind of what makes those unique. And that's, to me, kind of what starts the modern UFO phenomenon, or the modern chapter of the UFO phenomenon, is that the default assumption today is that these things are technological in nature. Through a lot of history, people would just assume that they were omens sent from God, warning signs, or spirits moving through the atmosphere, demons flying through the sky, angels moving through the sky. Very rarely were technological explanations kind of invoked.
Now, fast forwarding back to the 1940s, with the Kenneth Arnold sighting. Some of the drawings that were based off his testimony look very similar to one of the experimental Nazi aircraft, the Horten 229, which was later used as an inspiration for the B-2 stealth bomber. Now, some people would say, well, this was what he saw were essentially Americans trying to reverse engineer this Nazi technology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would you say to that explanation?
I mean, it's possible. Look, in general, in ufology, it's a good point made by a guy named John B. Alexander, who actually worked with Robert Bigelow, the aerospace billionaire. Worked for his group called NIDS. I can't remember what that stands for. But anyway, he did some investigations at Skinwalker Ranch, if you've heard of that. But he had a good book about UFOs, just kind of debunking a lot of myths and kind of laying out his own thoughts. And he made an important point where he says, we have to quit talking about the UFO phenomenon and start talking about UFO phenomena, because there, of course, could be multiple explanations for what UFOs are. And not every UFO seen, has the exact same explanation or the exact same origin. I mean, even if you assume that, the vast majority of them are aliens, not all of them necessarily come from the same planet or the same civilization, right? So yes, any given sighting could be a U.S. experimental craft or a Chinese experimental craft. Could be many things. So it's very hard to say. I think it's possible that Kenneth Arnold's sighting was of military craft, but I certainly don't think that explanation, can account for even a small minority of sightings. That year alone, or let alone the next 20 years. I mean, there are just thousands and thousands of UFO sightings every year, probably at least 10,000 globally. It's a very difficult number to tabulate because there's not really one central authority collecting all these reports. But yeah.
And one other thing too is the sort of UFO incidents that you like to discuss on your channel. What I think makes the cases you cover stronger than other cases is they often revolve around either trained, airline pilots or trained military pilots or trained military radar operators. We're talking about people who are not just your average civilian observing something they don't know what they're seeing. These are people that are trained to fly aircraft, trained to observe their surrounding areas. And it does seem interesting that so often people of that caliber just get blown away, and lumped in with just civilians. Mm-hmm. When these are completely different people with completely different skill sets and traits that make them more credible. I mean, we know why it happens, but because the system can't account for it. But it is interesting that with those cases, I would think though, in some way though, they should be more seriously considered, even with the biases against them, precisely because of the character witness of the people observing them. Why do you think even with that doesn't seem to be enough to get them to become more mainstreamed?
Like the fact that UFO sightings were coming from experienced, trained observers. I mean,
yeah,
I guess it's just. I've always felt like belief in UFOs was kind of a very fickle thing. I think a lot of popular beliefs are very fickle things. Not to sound like too condescending or anything, but a lot of people, they just don't care about majority of things. They're not really involved in science. They're not really going out and seeking out explanations on their own. And so I think the majority of people, they just kind of wait for an authority figure to sort of tell them what the truth is, and that could be people in the media. It could be science educators like Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson or something, or it could be the president or whoever else. But yeah, I mean, at that time, for the last, 60, 70, 80 years, we've just had science educators and university professors and politicians and everybody just sort of dismissing the UFO phenomenon. Everybody will admit that, yeah, sure, there are things seen in the sky that people can't immediately explain, but that doesn't mean we got to jump to aliens and all this kind of stuff. And I think that sort of messaging just made people feel like, well, this really can't be true. So even if you had fighter pilots and things coming forward and admitting that, yeah, we see these things, people would just sort of go, well, but Neil deGrasse Tyson says that they're probably not real, so I'm not willing to accept that. So I mean, I think popular belief in if UFOs has actually been pretty high. I think I don't know what it is now after all the kind of supposed disclosure stuff of the past few years, but I think something like 14% of Americans actually have claim they have seen UFOs themselves, and something like 40 or 50% actually believe that UFOs were real. I think a lot of polls kind of showed pretty high numbers that way. But just it's one of those things no one really wants to admit, until very recently, I think. Also doesn't help, of course, that the military does have rules about reporting UFO sightings and won't allow their own pilots and their own personnel to report sightings to the media. So there was a lot of kind of suppression of just exactly how many sightings there were and how many trained observers were seeing them.
Now, you mentioned Carl Sagan, and I remember, I don't know if it was one of your videos or some other UFO video I was watching, where I heard that there was one of those late night talk show hosts shows. They had Carl Sagan debate J. Allen Hynek, and apparently the episode and the transcript have been lost. And I'm like, yeah, is there anything you know about that?
I mean, I know that it exists, but yeah, unfortunately it's been lost. I've tried looking for it. I can't find anything really on it. So unfortunately, really can't say more than that. But yeah, that's kind of like a gold mine. I mean, it would be amazing to recover that footage if we could.
Now, what do you think about the claims that later in life, Carl Sagan confessed to Hynek that, yeah, I do believe in UFOs, but I just couldn't say it in public because I'd lose funding?
Yeah, I remember hearing those. I haven't looked in specifically into who claimed that and how credible those specific claims are. It wouldn't exactly surprise me, just based on what I know of Carl Sagan. He is someone, I think, who's very concerned about the kind of direction that civilization is heading in general. He's very concerned about science education. He's always kind of talking about science in a very like political sense, in a in the sense that like what are our duties as scientists to kind of inform people and keep people away from silly things like astrology and UFOs and this and that. So, but I also believe that he was a smart guy and a good scientist, and I know that at least very early in his career he was interested in the possibility of extraterrestrial life, and I think had a curiosity about UFO sightings, if nothing else. So it wouldn't surprise me if he did a little personal investigation, maybe thought, hey, there very well could be something to this, but also at the same time felt that, in my professional capacity, I could never actually back these things, and I could never go around telling people that they're real, because then it would cause, kids to start questioning authority, and it would cause kids to start questioning scientists and kind of established truths, and then it would allow other people to sort of it kind of validate other fields like astrology or other things that Carl Sagan would have just dismissed. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if you kind of made that political calculation and said, I believe this, but I can't go backing it. It would just be irresponsible.
Now, one of the things that I've always thought was odd, it was for the scientific establishment to take this sort of like debunking stance on the extraterrestrial explanation for UFOs, because one of the leading theories of the origin of life was by Francis Crick, and he believed in panspermia, where extraterrestrial life seeded Earth. So that always thought, I was always strange to me. Well, why would you admit that? But then, just dig your heels in and say, no UFOs, no UFOs. I mean, didn't you tacitly concede the ground right there?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Not to mention, I know Neil deGrasse Tyson, to bring him up again, he's kind of expressed interest in the simulation hypothesis that, all of consciousness or the entire world is just a computer simulation, that we're just kind of coded beings living in a programmed world. And to me, if you're willing to admit that, then why aren't you allowing yourself to admit that UFOs could exist? Like, if they could just be programmed into a computer program, I mean, that really opens up any possibility. Anything could be programmed, right? No matter how ridiculous. There could be dragons. If it's as easy as just typing in some code, then why not? So it is sort of weird what people and science educators will allow themselves to believe and what they won't allow themselves to believe.
Yeah, it just seems like one of those strange things. Now, so I think you mentioned also with the Foo Fighters and with the lights over Washington D.C., ball lightning was proposed as a solution. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of ball lightning as an explanation?
Yeah, I don't know how much that was ever really seriously proposed. I think, there are a few kind of letters to the editor in various newspapers where, individual scientists might have wrote in to say, hey, well, ball lightning could account for some UFO sightings. I don't know that there was any real serious debunker, like someone on the level of Donald Menzel, who was kind of the first Harvard debunker in the 50s, or on the level of Carl Sagan or someone like that, who actually seriously backed that. But from what I understand about ball lightning, it's exceptionally rare, and it forms under only very particular circumstances, and tends not to actually last that long. I think it generally only lasts a few seconds. So yeah, there could be again, we have to talk about UFO phenomena. Some UFOs could be ball lightning, but there's just no way that accounts for anywhere close to even the majority of UFO sightings across time. I mean, you just have to get into some details of some cases and know that some sightings last an hour. Some involve close-up experiences with entities and things like that. So to kind of dismiss all of that as ball lightning is pretty ridiculous.
Now, one of the arguments that I've heard in favor of the extraterrestrial or the extra dimensional hypothesis over the extraterrestrial one is that given the reported flight patterns of some of these either balls of light or ship-like observations, is that they make maneuvers that should be impossible based on known laws of physics.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that claim in favor of the extra dimensional argument?
Yeah, it's a good consideration. I don't know that it's one of the strongest arguments because, of course, you don't actually have to assume that there are pilots in craft at all. Even if you assume the extraterrestrial hypothesis is true, you could easily just assume that all UFOs are unmanned drones, right? So whether there's a being in there or not, is kind of irrelevant. But I mean, yeah, it's a consideration. Craft do perform maneuvers that would easily kill human pilots in the very least. I think
No.
the better explanations, Jacques Vallée had a bunch that he kind of laid out. One of them, one of the big theories at the time where the extraterrestrial hypothesis was dominant was that extraterrestrials were visiting Earth in order to kind of do a geological survey. And then there are a few sightings where craft land, some beings get out and appear to kind of play around in the dirt for a bit, or maybe pick up a rock or something and leave. Some UFOs have been seen kind of scooping up water from lakes and things. So this kind of led to this idea that these are basically just scientists from another planet coming here to study our planet. But of course, when you actually count how many sightings there are across time and around the world, again, I said it's something like 10,000 sightings a year or more. And this has been going on again for at least 80 years, really probably thousands of years. So if you assume that they're doing a geological survey, I mean, they're just sending way too many craft. We could easily do way more with just a couple of unmanned drones, in a few months to explore any other planet.
Yeah, we just got a question from the comments here. If you see that.
Claim that Von Braun said UFOs were used as a boogeyman excuse for
He is supposed to be aims, government aims.
government aims. Unfortunately, I don't know that claim. But I mean, I think you do see something like that happening today. I mean, I don't know if we really want to get into it right now, but all this kind of disclosure news in the last few years, the U.S. government starting to release some videos, getting kind of conduits like Tom DeLonge and Jeremy Corbell to release these videos for them. You see the government very much using the UFO phenomenon and trying to spin it as a threat, a potential national security threat. To me, they're just sort of drumming up more, trying to manufacture consent really for more funding into military and secret defense technologies. So it's definitely true that the UFO phenomenon can be exploited by governments. I think it's happening right now.
To what extent do you see the Fermi paradox as being devastating for the extraterrestrial explanation?
This is just remind me. This is the theory that you know it, it, if we were to see, or if UFOs truly exist, or if intelligent life truly exists in the universe and is as abundant as we think it is, then we should have seen um, more craft by now. Is that the
We should have made contact. So this is what it says on Wikipedia. There are billions of stars in the Milky Way, similar to the sun. With high probability, some of these stars have Earth-like planets in a certain stellar habitable zone. Many of these stars, and hence their planets, are much older than the sun. If the Earth is typical, some may have developed intelligent life long ago. Some of these civilizations may have developed interstellar travel, a step humans are investigating now. And Fermi died in 1953. At a slow pace of currently envisioned interstellar travel, the Milky Way could be completely traversed in a few million years. And since many of the stars similar to the sun are billions of years old, Earth should have already been visited by extraterrestrial civilizations, or at least other probes. However, there is no convincing evidence that this has happened. I guess where you might object is that last part.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, and there were a lot of scientists invoking the Fermi paradox in the 50s and 60s, but of course, at the very same time, they're also denying that all these sightings could possibly be extraterrestrials. So, yeah, but I mean, beyond that, I'm kind of big on just trying to distance UFOs from the whole concept of extraterrestrial life and the whole question of extraterrestrial life. I mean, I very much consider the extraterrestrial hypothesis as a valid hypothesis. I think it's one explanation amongst many that could account for what UFOs are. But I don't like the way a lot of people kind of read back from the extraterrestrial hypothesis to UFOs. Like you see it, again, when people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm really ragging on the guy today, but when these people go around debunking UFOs, they'll say things like, "Oh, well, just because it's a UFO doesn't mean that it's an alien, or doesn't mean that they're extraterrestrials." Or they'll kind of make arguments like, "Well, it's very unlikely that extraterrestrials could reach Earth. That the interstellar distances are just too great. Therefore, UFOs aren't real, or UFOs can't be real." Right? Like they're assuming that there's only one explanation for UFOs, and then kind of debunking that explanation, and therefore they think that they're debunking UFOs at the same time. But of course, that's not true. UFOs are just a reality. There are unidentified flying objects, and we have to figure out what those are. And then, of course, there's many explanations for what they are. So just because you can disprove the extraterrestrial hypothesis, no one really can disprove that, of course, strictly speaking. But just because you can cast doubt on that and argue that, it's very unlikely that intelligent life exists or intelligent life could get here, doesn't mean that you've disproved UFOs. Like, we really have to keep those separate, and we really have to be careful about talking about UFOs and not kind of using UFOs and aliens, or UFOs and extraterrestrial spaceships interchangeably.
Now, you had mentioned that it would be more helpful to see this whole question as UFO phenomena, not just one thing. So what would you say would be the most plausible, I don't know how many phenomena you think there might be, but let's say the top three. What do you think those three independent phenomena or more might be, and then which observed UFO sightings fall in them?
Sure, that was a good question. I don't even necessarily know that I describe any of these hypotheses as plausible. They all seem pretty implausible to me, to be honest. But that's just sort of the nature of the phenomenon. It's pretty ridiculous. There's just a lot of strange cases, a lot of weird data, a lot of apparent contradictions in the data, a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense. So, you kind of have to wade into the deep end a little bit when you're trying to come up with explanations. But I would say, one, the interdimensional hypothesis. So basically assuming that these things are beings, biological or otherwise, that don't necessarily come from another planet, but might come from some other dimension. They might, live here on Earth with us, but exist in some dimension that we can't feel or see or hear, or something like that. Another explanation, I think, is that they're time travelers. A lot of people posit that these beings, you kind of imagine the typical gray alien, right, with the big head and the big black eyes, kind of almond-shaped eyes. A lot of people posit, well, that could be a super advanced human. That could be humans 3 or 4 million years ahead in evolution, where they've maybe gone into space, living in different kind of gravity conditions. Their bodies have sort of atrophied, their muscles have all sort of disappeared, but their heads have grown to make more rooms for their brain because they're mostly thinking beings at this point, and they do very little physical labor. So there's that kind of idea that they're time travelers going back in time, maybe to alter events, maybe to avoid some catastrophe in their own timeline, or maybe to breed with humans and collect human DNA or something to rescue their own species in the future. And lastly, if I had to pick a third explanation, I guess I would say that it's something spiritual, for lack of a better word. That maybe these things are like sort of guardian spirits or something. Again, I believe that UFOs and entity encounters have been with us for thousands of years. They've really been here, as long as human history has been recorded. And so perhaps that these are some sort of guardians here helping humans evolve or helping humans develop, helping us avoid catastrophes or grow spiritually or technologically or something of that nature.
Now, within the modern context, so like the last maybe 80 years,
Mm-hmm.
If we could classify these phenomena and experiences, I think we could say that some are negative, hostile, scary experiences. Some are neutral, like, well, that was just weird.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are positive. I remember you covered on your channel this one guy that was actually healed
Mm-hmm.
by one of these phenomena. So
Mm-hmm.
which is most common, in order, like, of those three known kinds of experiences? What are the most common? What are the least common of those three?
I would say most common are just I don't want to say neutral. I don't think very many are really neutral, because I mean, just the fact that you're seeing a UFO is pretty extraordinary, right? People tend to be pretty amazed by that. It's something that people hang on to for the rest of their lives, right? Even if the encounter itself is not particularly violent or shocking, or doesn't reveal any information to them or anything like that. But I would say the vast majority of sightings kind of appear what I would call like frivolous. A lot of UFOs just are very playful. They kind of dance around in the sky. A lot of sightings, it almost seems like the UFO is merely trying to convince the person seeing it that it is a UFO. Um, so, people will make the assumption, oh, well, that must be a helicopter. And then it'll kind of stop in the air and reverse course, move backwards. And they go, okay, well, a helicopter can't do that. It must be a drone or something. And then, the lights will turn off and it'll reappear in a different section of the sky. And people will say, well, a drone can't do that. And it'll kind of do whatever it has to do until you've ruled out all explanations, until you really confront the fact that, yes, I'm looking at a UFO. And then it'll just simply vanish in the air. A lot of military sightings, just seem to be taunting military personnel, like sort of dance around on the radar screen, follow jets, just sort of freak them out. People try to shake them, and then eventually the UFO just disappears, and there doesn't really seem to be any specific point to the sighting. The UFO doesn't seem to be communicating any specific information or issuing any warning or prophecy or anything of that nature. It just sort of wants to intrude in your reality, intrude into the reality of the witness, and just kind of just leave you with with lingering questions, I suppose.
Now, with Jacques Vallée's particular take on this, he seems to think that there's a sort of common intelligence behind these experiences with gods or fairies or UFOs, and they appear in culturally appropriate context, and that they're trying to subvert the existing norms
Mm-hmm.
or something new.
Right.
Does Jacques Vallée speculate on what he thinks the ultimate goal of that process is? What are they striving for?
Yeah, not really. I mean, he keeps an open mind, but yeah, he does suggest that they are working kind of at the level of symbology and mythology, and maybe even spirituality, and just sort of moving civilization in very subtle kind of directions over long time periods. So I think what we can rule out pretty conclusively is that UFOs don't stop wars. They don't stop people from killing each other. It's not like they're here to kind of enforce world peace or anything like that. I mean, obviously, the world is still a mess. People are still killing each other left, right, and center. So they don't really seem to be involved on that kind of like micro level, influencing politics or foreign affairs or trying to stop very specific outcomes. Whatever they're doing, they're working on a kind of very deep level, and they're working over very, very, very long time periods. He does kind of suggest that, one commonality between most sightings in most contexts is that they seem to want to try to dissolve existing belief systems and maybe kind of open the door to new, maybe more radical belief systems. He doesn't really speculate on exactly what the end game is there. I mean, we could all speculate ourselves, but something interesting to think about.
Now, the idea of space travel and using some sort of hallucinogen, of course, is popularized with the Dune franchise, the Spice. Now, you recently came out with a video about, was it DMT, right?
Yep.
To what extent, and because, you talk about how that's a mind or a consciousness expanding drug, and how a lot of these UFO phenomena are about, at least from Jacques Vallée's vantage point, are to expand, our consciousness or our way to look at the world differently. Do you think that those are in any way related in the sense that they sort of are doing the same thing but in different ways?
Yeah, I do. I think that's a great question, and I do think they're related. That was actually something noted by Rick Strassman, who was kind of the first guy to do clinical DMT research in the United States, beginning in, I think, 1990. And when he published the results of his research in a book called DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which was since made into a documentary, he did note that a lot of the things that people report actually bear striking resemblance to UFO encounters. And he cited John Mack's work, who had a book on abductions at the time in the 90s. And he said, yeah, if you go read John Mack's Abductions, you read all these accounts of people waking up on some sort of operating table, in some sort of apparent medical room and being picked apart or cut open or something, being worked on somehow by entities, often very scary looking, reptilian entities. And Rick Strassman noted that, time and time again, that almost exact scenario would show up amongst people doing DMT. So, of course, the question is, kind of which way does that similarity go? Are UFOs sort of like drug hallucinations? Basically, are they kind of mental fabrications? Are they something that exists, within our own heads? Are they imagined, or just the kind of similarity go the other way? Can we assume that DMT trips are actually real in some sense, in the same way that UFO encounters are? And it's very hard to say, but I do definitely think that they are very related. I mean, one thing I think we can definitely say about UFOs, and again, this goes back to Jacques Vallée and more specifically John Keel in 1970, who said that UFOs do seem to interact with our consciousness. They seem to know who they're appearing to. They seem to know the beliefs of the people that they're appearing to. They seem to know, again, what technologies those people expect to exist, or which entities or spirits or something that those people expect to exist, because that's the only way that they could really disguise themselves in our kind of in the mythology and in the technological frame of reference at the time, and the way that they do.
I don't even think disguise is the right word. If you've ever seen the Soviet science fiction film Solaris, it's about a Soviet mission to another planet that is completely, utterly alien to man. And the whole point of the film is the difficulty of an alien intelligence communicating with a human one. Because the assumption of the director is that our experiences are so radically different that what common ground can there possibly be? The biggest struggle in the film is trying to find a common ground where the alien intelligence, the planetary alien intelligence, can communicate with the humans. But another interesting connection here, right, is a lot of in ancient religions, pagan religions, just seeing visions or talking to the gods was often the result of ingesting a hallucinogenic drug. And we see that, even the graphic novel author Alan Moore claims to have a spirit guide, and he claims that when he trips out, he talks to a snake god called Asclepius, and he, in one of his interviews, he was saying that friends would say, "Oh, I don't believe you." He's like, "Well, take a trip with me and I'll show you." And they're all tripping out, and he's like, "You see what I'm seeing?" They're like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Yeah, that's my spirit guide." And so So to what? So I think you would say is that all three of these sort of are kind of related. It's almost like these more ancient civilizations were aware that there were doors that you could open to these other vistas, and the only way they could knew how to do it was through either hallucinogenic drugs or self-induced hallucination by starvation and fasting. Think of like an Indian vision quest, or like some of the monks from the Middle Ages. They would because you can replicate, if I'm not mistaken, you can replicate similar psychological states by extreme deprivation that you could with taking a hallucinogenic drug.
Not to mention, dreams or lucid dreaming exercises. Yeah, I mean, there's so many connections. And the other thing is, in a lot of shamanic traditions, in more kind of tribal societies, you'll undergo what I think they call the shamanic journey. So any aspiring shaman has to go through this ordeal where, again, they'll drink a lot of hallucinogens or do hallucinogenic drugs, and they report this kind of common experience, again, of being torn apart by beings. And a lot of the oldest cave art in the world, this is something that Graham Hancock, the writer, has talked about and shared a few images of. A lot of the oldest cave art in the world shows people, being impaled by spears in every direction, and some sort of beings standing over these people. And he's arguing that this is an illustration of the shamanic journey. So it just, and if you think about that scenario, like waking up with these, strange, apparently superior beings standing around you and tearing your body apart and kind of putting it back together again. I mean, a very powerful and evocative kind of imagery. It's a very powerful, there's the symbolism of that is very powerful. And it just kind of leads you to believe that you are somehow being upgraded, even without knowing the details of the procedure or exactly knowing what they're doing on you. Of course, they never really explain. It's hard to walk away from that without the feeling that somehow you've been upgraded, or somehow you've been given some new power, or something bad has been removed from you. So yeah, that scenario kind of playing out in so many different realms is just really interesting.
Well, seeing as we're nearing the end of the hour, I think I'd like to start wrapping up. Is there anything that you'd like to specifically leave us with?
Yeah, just again, I think it's really important that not to dismiss the idea of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Again, I'll always say that I really believe that could turn out to be the explanation for UFOs. But I would encourage anybody, especially if you're not all that familiar with UFOs or ufology, just to sort of put that on the back burner, consider it one explanation among many, and just sort of focus on UFOs, and please call them that. Don't call them aliens. If you're asking somebody about the subject, use the term UFOs or UAPs or something similar. And just try to think about alternatives to that, because I don't know. There's a whole range of different explanations out there, and the extraterrestrial hypothesis is not necessarily the best one. And if you go into study UFOs, assuming that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is correct, you're going to end up sort of picking cases that fit that, right? And you're going to be a little more choosy in the data. You might dismiss some cases that don't seem to fit the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And I just think that it's a bad way of going about it. So separate UFOs from aliens and consider some alternatives.
Well, thanks again, Jason. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.